Hey guys, it's Aman and Christina from the Our Rich Journey podcast, where we answer your questions about making, saving, and investing money for financial independence. Today, we have a question about CD ladders. And I know this is going to start to be at the forefront of a lot of people's minds because interest rates are rising, and that means CD yields are also going to be rising.
Yes, I think this is perfect timing. This question is from Samantha. She's asking about CD ladders as it pertains to her emergency fund. So let's listen to her question.
Hi, my name is Samantha. My husband and I have a high yield savings that we use for our emergency fund. And we were considering putting some of that emergency fund into CDs so it can gain a little bit more interest. We were planning on keeping 3 months in the high yield account and then laddering the CDs for the remaining part. What do you think about that? And if you think it's a good idea, how do we go about doing it? Because we can't seem to figure it out to have something like expire or mature every 3 months. Thanks.
Oh, this is a very interesting question. Okay, so first of all, let's define what a CD ladder is. The idea with a CD ladder is that you are taking a large sum of money and you are dividing that money up between various CDs that have different maturity dates. Okay, CDs, certificate of deposits. So when you invest in a CD, you usually get a interest rate for investing in that CD for a certain period of time. Well, you can buy CDs that come in different increments of time, and depending on the certain increment of time will dictate the amount of interest you get. So usually the longer the CD maturity date is out, the higher the interest rate you get. So if you have a 1 month CD, you may only get an interest rate of 0.5%. But if you have a 10-year CD, you may get an interest rate of 4%. And you are paid out interest from those CDs. So her question is, first of all, is it a good idea to do CD ladders? And then second of all, how do you go about doing it? Now, let's answer the first question first. Is it a good idea? CD ladders are something that we actually have our emergency fund in CD ladders. We think it's a good idea because with our CD ladders, the money is accessible. Emergency funds are all about being able to access that money.
Yeah, I think, a lot of people, when they talk about an emergency fund, sometimes people come to us and say, I'm thinking about putting my emergency fund money in such and such stock or even such and such index fund because it's doing really well right now. But the thing about the stock market, for example, is it's very volatile and you can't predict the volatility. You don't know when it's going to go up, when it's going to go down. And the idea about your emergency fund is that you want to keep it in a safe and secure place because you want to be able to access it in the event of an emergency. So if you put your money into the stock market, for example, the stock market crashes and then you find yourself in an emergency where you need to access the money, then you're forced to access this money when the stock market has crashed. Your portfolio is a lot less now. You're going to have to sell your investment at a loss when you're putting your money into the stock market like that. But when you're thinking about having safe and secure money in an emergency fund, you're not thinking primarily about growing your money. You're thinking about where can I keep it safe and secure? And Samantha talked about a high yield savings account. She talked about a CD. These are places where traditionally you can put your money into. It's safe. And a CD ladder allows for more accessibility with that money.
And you get a little bit of growth, right?
That's right.
You get more growth than you would in a high yielding savings account.
Correct.
And you still have access to that money should you need it in an emergency. Now, you may have to forfeit some of the interest that you've accrued because you've cashed out that CD before its maturity date. But the idea is that you take this additional money and you split it up amongst all of these CDs with various maturity dates. And they call it a ladder because as one CD expires, you move that money from that expired CD into another CD that has a further out maturity date. So you stagger your money amongst all of these CDs. So let's say you buy a 3-month CD, a 6-month CD, a 1-year CD, a 2-year CD, and as those CDs start to expire, you move it up to the highest level of maturity. So it's a great thing to do. Now, it can be a little work intensive, right? Because you have to keep track of the CD, and then once that CD expires, you got to do the whole daisy chain movement thing. We have more than 3 months of money in an emergency fund in our CD. We actually have close to 2 years of expenses in CDs. And so our CD ladder is a lot longer than what she's talking about doing. It sounds like she has 6 months of emergency fund, 3 months in the high yield savings account, and she wants to put the next 3 months in a CD. So how does she split 3 months? This is the next part of the question. How does she split 3 months of living expenses amongst various CDs? Does she do multiple CDs, or does she just do a 3-month CD and then just keep turning that over as the 3 months expire?
You know, one thing I think it depends on is when you have an emergency, for example. So Aman and I, our emergency fund is actually more than 2 years. If an emergency should occur, we don't anticipate that we would need more than 2 years of emergency funds the very next day. The reason why we created it was if there was a stock market crash and we didn't want to be in a position where we'd have to be pulling from the stock market during the crash. We'd never have expenses that would happen the very next day after a crash and we'd need to pull out 2.5 years worth of living expenses to pay for something. So the idea is that when you stagger something into a CD ladder or into any type of emergency fund that you're creating, you have to think about the situation that you could be in and how much money you would need to access immediately and how much money you could access a little bit further down the line. So for us, for example, we would need to basically access 1 month at a time of expenses over the time where there was a stock market crash, for example. So we wouldn't need everything all at once. So when you're thinking about building your CD ladder, you have to think about, okay, am I going to need 3 months of living expenses right after a crash or right during an emergency? Say you lost your job, would you need 3 months right there? Or would you need 1 month and then the next month and then the next month? Because it sounds like you have about 6 months, right? You could go to your high yield savings account and then wait for that maturity in the CD or the CD ladders, the multiple CDs that you have in order to access that. So when you're thinking about CD ladders, and the time frame in between the different CD maturity rates that you're developing, think about when you would potentially need to access emergency fund money. And usually people, when they think about that, they're thinking about, if you are on the FIRE journey, you're thinking about, for example, if I lose my job, if my partner loses a job, how will we be able to access our emergency funds in order to pay for expenses during that time?
And that's what ours does, right? Our emergency fund covers our expenses should we not pull from the stock market. So the ladder is in sync with the time frame that we would be going into if we couldn't pull from our stock portfolio. So we have a 3-month CD. We would live off of that CD for 3 months, and we'd transition into the next period of CDs and the next period of CDs until we were able to recover our money from the stock market. And so I think it depends on her situation. It sounds like she has the high yield savings account and she can live off of that for 3 months should an emergency occur. And at that point, she needs to be able to access the next 3 months worth of money so she can get through the next period of emergency. So because it's a relatively small amount of money, I think if she's going to put it in a CD that is maturing much further out, she should recognize that if she does have to pull it out sooner, she's going to lose the interest on that. And maybe that's a risk that she's willing to make, but that's not how a CD ladder is theoretically supposed to work. You're supposed to be staggering it so that when you need the money, you're able to access it without incurring that penalty of losing the interest.
Right, right. So again, it really depends on everyone's sort of unique situation. After you reach FIRE, you ideally have a much larger fire emergency fund because your ability to pay expenses are usually more contingent on the performance of the stock market or the performance of your real estate. So you have a much larger fire emergency fund where you can better create this type of ladder because you have more money and you won't need to access, for example, like I said, 2 years right after a crash or something like that.
You know what's interesting about the emergency fund? I have to bring this up because in the back of folks' minds, they should be thinking about, when people refer to emergency funds, they're talking about covering monthly expenses most of the time. Mm-hmm. But what about the emergencies that require a large lump sum of money in order to deal with a certain situation? I guess the idea is that if you have an emergency that requires a bunch of money at once, you can access that money from your emergency fund and feel confident that you can replenish it because you're not losing your job at the same time, right? That's the idea when you're in need of a large lump sum of money to, let's say, repair the roof or pay for an expensive flight because you have to go somewhere in an emergency. There's also that type of emergency fund, right? Mm-hmm. The emergency fund that you need in order to deal with an expense that all of a sudden hits you.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an important thing to keep in mind, right? Because we talk about there's so many different types of emergencies that can happen. So first of all, understanding how to access that emergency fund, but then also keeping in mind how you can replenish that emergency fund, right? And then another thing that made me think of as well is that if you built your emergency fund, let's say like 3 years ago, and you based it off of 6 months of living expenses, and now with insane inflation, you actually may need to be replenishing your emergency fund now, even if you haven't pulled from it, right? So It's thinking about where you're going to hold it, how you're going to access it, and then how you're going to replenish it also.
And how you're going to adjust it for inflation. That's an excellent point because if most folks' money was sitting in a savings account over these past 2 years with inflation at the rate it was now, that emergency fund isn't going to get you as far. Right. So you should definitely be thinking about putting a little bit more money into those emergency funds.
Yeah. So to answer your question, yes, we think that CDs are a great place to store an emergency fund. For a CD ladder, it's typically easier if you have a lot more money necessary for an emergency fund, but it can still be done if you have, a 6-month emergency fund. It's still possible. But in general, we think you can put your money into a CD in a way where you can make it accessible and it's safe, and you can still pull from it early. You just lose that interest. So hopefully that answered your question. You can go in to look at different CD rates that might be available now.
And CD conditions. Because not every CD has the same conditions. You may have to give up more than just the interest, right? You may have to lose some principal with certain CDs. Stay away from those CDs. But do your research whenever you're picking whatever CD you're planning on building this ladder with.
Yeah, that sounds like homework.
That we always have homework.
Do we? Yeah.
This podcast is like you just can't listen to it and not take action. You have to take action on afterwards.
Something. Okay, yeah. So if you're interested in building a CD ladder, you need to go out, find the best CD rates that are available, but also the conditions attached to the rates, because maybe something is an incredible rate, but the conditions aren't really what you're looking for. So go out, find some different CDs that would be great for your CD ladder. And if you guys have questions, make sure you send them to us. You can send them to us at ourjourney.com/podcast. Send us your questions so that hopefully we can go over our answer in a future podcast. And until then, we will see you tomorrow. Remember that we are not financial advisors and the views expressed by us are solely for entertainment purposes. You must make responsible decisions, and that means making decisions based on the thorough, independent research that you conduct. Thanks for listening.